Parc Zoologique. I got there by taking a tram along a long, high, off-white wall. As I passed palm tree after palm tree and watched the sun beat down on the bustling masses of people outside, I had the feeling I was traveling through a colonial city in South America. I found myself thinking about Colonel Winda and the ice, and then it hit me. I'd never been to South America. I decided that next time I wanted to see a city on the other side of the Atlantic. Maybe I could even get there by boat. I walked to the souvenir stand near the gate to the zoo. I bought a plush elephant that had a deep, thoughtful gaze in its beady eyes. The last time I was here, we came straight from the Sagrada Familia. She said she wanted to see the elephants. In the metro, she told me about how intelligent they were and how, if you didn't disturb them, they could figure out how to use tools. The queue to the zoo was ginormous. I saw her face drop a little, and then the strangest thing happened. Out of nowhere, green parrots started flying above us, flitting like arrows between one palm tree and the next. "Let's follow them," she cried, grabbing my hand and dragging me inside the park. I stood in front of the gates to the zoo. The queue was again ginormous. I went on. I stayed in the park for a little while longer. Eventually, I had to leave the elephants and the parrots behind. I continued, retracing my steps. A sudden breeze brought the salty smell of sea rushing toward me. The beach. It was crowded with people sunbathing, coming and going from the water, laughing and screaming joyfully. Children were building tall sandcastles and pouring water over them. The constructions resembled the Sagrada Familia so much that it stopped me in my tracks. I took a photo. I knew this beach. It was hard to forget. We got here from the zoo, took off our shoes, and waded along the beach in the warm water. I watched our footprints, side by side, settle in the sand, only to disappear when the next wave came in. We didn't have swimsuits. "Since when is that a problem?" She teased me, but I couldn't help but laugh. We bought 2 huge plastic glasses of sangria and sipped them as we watched the setting sun. Then we kissed. Her lips tasted of fruit and the sea. I know it sounds like a cliché, but that's how it was. Eventually, I had to go. The sound of the waves gave way to the continuous bustle of La Rambla. All that walking and thinking stirred my memories. La Rambla. I stood in front of the Columbus Monument, looking up toward the main street of Barrio Gothic, the oldest part of the city. The sun was blasting down, and swarms of sweaty, chatty, slightly sunburned tourists filled La Rambla. I remembered the last time I was here. We started from the Columbus Monument and walked against the current of tourists, like salmon swimming upstream. We held hands, talked, laughed, and slowly drifted away from the crowds. La Rambla was for tourists, and we were too focused on each other to even notice where we were. I walked up the street. "Bloody tourists," I heard a soft chuckle behind me. "There's always someone's ass in your way when you want to take a decent picture." I spun around. There was a man with a camera behind me. The lens attached to it meant business. He was tall, a bit scruffy looking, and had the greenest eyes I'd ever seen. "I'm sorry," I said, and moved out of his way toward a gap in the crowd. I continued up La Rambla. Shaded by the plane trees on either side of the street, I looked around, admiring the architecture. It was so different from what I was used to in Warsaw. So much more Mediterranean. I liked the panache and the order of things here. The small cafes and flower stalls, the traffic on both sides of La Rambla, even the swarms of tourists. The city felt lived in, embracing you like a perfectly tailored suit. I shook my head. I didn't even know where that thought had come from. I found myself in front of a souvenir shop and looked inside. There they were, the most bizarre things I could remember from last year. When I first saw them, I couldn't believe my eyes. There were rows of figurines depicting famous people, real and imaginary, all squatting with their pants down and an unmistakable turd below their naked butt cheeks. Els Casaners, she said when I pointed to them. There's always been one in the Catalan nativity, shitting happily to show people that even in the presence of God, poo always wins. It was a weird tradition. Should I buy one? I had mixed feelings. I peeked into one of the souvenir shops and looked at the rows of shitting figures. After much deliberation, I chose a businessman, looking very smart with his suit and tie and laptop and his trousers down. He was probably hitting a deadline. This was the weirdest souvenir I'd ever bought. That was enough of the hustle and bustle of La Rambla for me. What next? Maybe El Raval? I was sure that a year ago we were heading away from the sea, away from the tourist traps. A memory. There you are. The example. A grid of buildings that all look the same. Streets like canyons, rows of trees, plenty of parked cars. But I remembered there was a bar in one of the smaller streets, and I knew exactly how to reach it. For a moment, I felt lost in the maze of almost identical buildings. Soon, I saw the bar where we spent that night 1 year ago. I still had some time to prepare for the day. El Raval. Before I went to Barcelona last year, my friend who studied there in the late 90s warned me about this place. Apparently, it was easier to buy dope there than to find a decent coffee place. It's changed a lot since then. I stood in front of the sculpture of a gigantic cat. It was a dusky, golden in the glow of the streetlights, staring at tourists with a hint of melancholy. I remembered that cat. We turned left off the crowded La Rambla and went into El Raval. When we got to the cat, she tried to mount it. I was mortified, but I couldn't help staring at her legs. There were students on skateboards, women talking loudly, and in the narrow streets I saw a whole line of laundry hanging from a rope between two balconies. She stopped in front of a closed perfume shop, looked inside, sighed, and dragged me to a small restaurant. The food was delicious. The wine was sparkling, which was a surprise. I'd asked for coffee and got a bottle of cava instead, and we talked about our childhood experiences with our pets. Then she glanced at her watch, snapped her fingers at the waiter, and said that we should hurry because she wanted to show me something. I felt a rumbling in my stomach. I decided it was time to eat. I chose a small bar. The waitress resembled the chubby brass cat and flooded me with words in Catalan that I didn't understand. When I used some rudimentary Spanish, her eyes narrowed. I could swear I saw a tail swishing angrily behind her. "Do you need help?" asked someone behind me. The man looked like he'd stepped out of an American surf poster. He was tall, tanned, and had tousled blonde hair. He flashed his perfect American smile at me. "Yes, please," I said. "I'm hungry." He spoke Catalan fluently with just a hint of an accent. The waitress shrugged and went into the kitchen. "I ordered you the house special," he said. "They have some amazing seafood here." I ate. He talked. Catalans didn't like strangers, he explained. Their history was complicated enough to be mistrustful. "But you speak Catalan?" I asked how he'd learned the language. His family was from here, he'd explained. He learned it was a child from his grandparents. His grandfather never learned to speak English very well, and he refused to speak Spanish, so it was the only language they could communicate in. His grandmother spoke French, Spanish, and Catalan. Why did he refuse to speak Spanish? I asked. His smile vanished for a moment. It's complicated, he said. Let's just say it had a lot to do with the Montjuic and the Civil War. I finished my meal and thanked him and the waitress with my newly learned merci. The street I headed toward Plaça de Catalunya. I was already late for our date at the bar. Outside the bar, peaceful. The bar was on the other side of the street. Through the windows I could see it was crowded inside. People were laughing, talking excitedly, sitting alone with drinks, some with noses in their phones, some making a toast. The crowd spilled outside and occupied tables scattered on the sidewalk. Music pulsed through the fragrant air. The bar an island of light and laughter beneath the trees and dark, high walls of apartment blocks. A pack of condoms was sitting in my pocket. Better safe than sorry. I scanned the crowd, looking for her face, but she was nowhere to be seen. She was probably sitting out inside, or late like I was. I was glad for the chance to collect my thoughts. This trip had been tiring, no doubt about that, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so peaceful or at ease. The crowd in the bar was so colorful and alive, the city so full of wonder and beauty, so friendly that I felt like I could just stay there forever. The only thing I lacked was someone to share the moment with. Was that not the most important thing? Human contact? Back home, blinded by stress and stuck in my routine, I'd grown used to being alone. During my journey, the brightest points were the unexpected meetings and conversations, the brief windows that allowed me to see into the lives of others. I couldn't be sure if the girl was waiting for me at the bar, but even if she wasn't, I was sure to meet someone worth talking to. I looked at the faded Polaroid for one last time, and then I looked around me. Everything was like the year before. Warm, balmy air, music, Barcelona, a crowd outside a bar, still no sign of her. I put the picture away and looked around. I felt like I'd opened my eyes for the first time. This part of my journey had come to an end, but the next one had just begun. Every step I took was a step toward new destinations and new revelations. I realized that once you start traveling, it was hard to stop. I'd find her when I was ready. Tomek risked his job to go on this trip because he couldn't forget about the woman. And yet, in the last moment, he turned around and walked away. They talked. What comes next? As the silence grew, it became clear that the story was over. I can't believe you just left, laughed Henry. That takes some balls. But was she waiting for you? Adelia asked. What happened to her? He just smiled. I don't know. I never went in. Adelia and Tomek had a rough start. Perhaps he reminded her of her husband too much. I couldn't believe that all that counting and planning you did at the beginning. And yet, in the end, it wasn't important at all, Adelia said. Wasn't it scary for you? I guess. I don't really think much about that time, to be honest. Just like I don't think about the air that I breathe. He shrugged. That journey was about breaking free from work. not about experimenting with my perception of philosophical concepts. But every new experience changes your perception, Adelia said, shaking her head. It just takes some time to reflect on your life. They discussed it for a while, but then a new round of beers arrived. It's fucking expensive in here. Henry shook his head. Have you noticed? You can afford it, Dad. Henriette raised her glass. You know what I think? All of our traveling is just a reckless ego trip. Tomek let out a long sigh. We claim to be all the wiser for it, but all we're really looking for is our own satisfaction and a thrill, no matter what it costs us or others. They sat and talked long after the sun had set. So, who's telling a story tomorrow? Tomek asked when the party started to break up.